I'll start by saying thanks to the great three individuals joining. So I'll start with Sheryl, Allen, Angel, Gambino, and Arun, Sajjan. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm looking for Arun. Okay, I see his frame up there. Sheryl's joining us from the Pandora side of the Sirius XM Pandora house. Angel, investor, serial entrepreneur. I think your most recent working stiff job, Angel, was Chief Commercial Officer at Napster, up to a lot of interesting things. And Arun, who is currently part of Anghami, heading up the licensing side of it, also has a mixed background. I think you even have some Sony history in your CV somewhere there. I'm particularly excited about Arun's joining. As an ethnically Lebanese American, I've been fascinated by Anghami and hope to learn more about what's going on in the Arab world and entertainment in that space. So really exciting group. As all of you would have seen from the agenda, we're going to talk for a little while about differentiation and innovation in streaming services. That means we get a chance to talk about some great ideas happening in different markets around the world, as well as a little bit of what's next. And we're going to be following the structure, but all the panelists know to jump in on any of the topics as they see fit, or if they have thoughts they want to chime in on. So we're going to leave ourselves open, our mics open, and just go at it. As a way of getting us started, Sheryl, if you don't mind, would you mind speaking for a minute about Pandora and Sirius XM, and a company who's really defined the category and therefore has almost been defining the leading edge? Would you mind talking about the stuff, to the extent that you can, you're all thinking about now, or what's next coming out of the Pandora Sirius world?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So one of the things that we're really excited about since SiriusXM had acquired Pandora is that SiriusXM has access to sort of all of this really exciting, fresh studio content that comes in on a regular basis. And those types of experiences, I think, potentially mixed with Pandora's genome, is really exciting to us. Pandora, for those of you that might not know, is really known in the US for having a sort of state-of-the-art music genome that does radio play. And the idea of being able to combine that music genome, not just for music, but also thinking about it for podcasts and mixing it with some of those live experiences, news, sports, gossip, etc., is really sort of where we see the future. So.
Excellent, thank you. Angel, I'm gonna turn to you next. I know you tend to sit in the seat as a consumer when you're thinking about what you want to work on next. What's got your attention right now? What are some of the things that we should be aware of that you've been watching probably for 6 to 12 to 18 months?
So I've been listening more than observing, and in the context of, unlike many consumers, my streaming consumption has, shot up radically. And I think, and I've got access to all the DSPs for the most part. And I think, one of the things that I'm struck by from a consumer standpoint is that there isn't so much differentiation between the streaming services from an experiential standpoint. So I think, one of the things that, that needs to happen, and kind of the purpose of this discussion is looking at, not just expanding into other genres of programming, i.e., podcasts, but what can the DSPs and the wider ecosystem of, of startups, of, people who are working in music tech, on a daily basis, what can we do from a kind of product and service and experiential standpoint to help take, playlisting and discovery to the next stage? I found myself either, playing a lot of Pandora radio stations. I actually found some really good ones on, on Spotify. And, but then I was defaulting to a lot of my standard playlists, over this period of time. And so I think, one of the things that, that we can all do together is start to potentially look at ways that we can make it easier for DSPs to partner with startups, because I think that, a lot of the DSPs have become kind of like the big labels or big media companies in the challenge that innovators and creators have in engaging. Like, a lot of artists know how difficult it can be to get into a playlist. Well, it's very similar for, for people who are developing new applications, which can actually help drive, participation and consumption. And, right now I'm on the board of directors of a company called Audible Reality, and they have created something called Vibes, which is, essentially, what Instagram does for, filters and photos and allows you to personalize images. They allow you to do that for music tracks. So, and what we're seeing is that, that fans and super fans are listening to a song over and over and over because they have different ways to hear it, different ways to experience it. So I think that there's a lot of room for us to create new experiences that will drive streaming consumption. And right now that's really important because artists don't have, these other income streams like touring, et cetera. So, they're more reliant on streaming consumption. So I think, together we really need to make it easier for us to partner together so we can create new experiences that help drive new discovery, that help drive new kind of consumption behaviors.
That's great. And I'm going to come back to it because I think that's a central theme to this panel. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Arun, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to do two things. One is, because our listener viewers may not be as familiar with Anghami, would you spend just a minute talking about Anghami and then talk about some of the things in your day-to-day in the service that actually might be unique in other markets, but they're commonplace or standard for Anghami as a way of kind of coming back to Angel's point as
Sure.
well.
Yeah, I mean, so Anghami, for those who don't know about what it is, we are the biggest music streaming service in the Middle East and North Africa. We basically service, music from all the way starting from Oman all the way till Morocco. So that's a pretty, big region where predominantly everyone speaks Arabic. So we started in 2012. We got a head start. Back then, there was not a lot of streaming or music services in the Middle East. So we kind of, had that head start back then. But, over the years, we've gone on to become the biggest streaming service in the region. Coming back to, your topic of, what we've been doing off late, especially in the last 7-8 months since pretty much the whole world went on a lockdown. We started, realizing that like Angel pointed out that, there had to be some differentiation, right? So what we started looking at was how we could, how could we be different from the other services that are available in this market. So we actually went about doing, we were the first ones to actually start live streaming. So we, got a bunch of artists. First, we started on the social media handles, wherein Anghami, on Anghami's Instagram channel, the different artists would come and, perform live gigs. We started right back in March, I think. The latest thing that we've done now, as a differentiator, is we've actually started a live radio feature, which essentially means that we don't have live radio channels, but we actually let the users become radio personalities. So what they can do is that they can actually get their friends on this on the platform to actually join him on his radio session. So he can be a DJ, a disc jock, and then people can follow him, and then he can become his own little radio personality. So it's a very interesting thing that we've done there. It's specifically because there are super influencers. And we want the users to become those influencers rather than, just relying on the on our curators or AI for playlist, taste making, or even the artists for that matter. So every user is basically a taste maker now. So pretty cool things that we've done off late.
And what are the different ways that you monetize your consumers and users, Arun? How should we think about the revenue mix?
Okay, so Middle East poses its own unique challenges. On the positive side, we are a pretty mobile, savvy region. So in some countries, we've got almost 200% mobile penetration, i.e., one user could have 2 mobile phones on an average. But on the other hand, we also see that, credit card acceptance is not so high in the Middle East. So what we did as a differentiator was that we actually went about, right when we started, we went about doing all the mobile telco, bundling deals. So now if you're in the region, whatever network you're on, you will pretty much always find a, telco bundle to go with. I mean, if you have a data plan, you'll find Anghami on it, through some kind of a bundle. Our mix in terms of, how we monetize the customers, most of them, because there is a less credit card acceptance, most of them are on advertising based solution, which is a freemium tier. You may not have all the features as such as that you get on a on-demand, premium packs, but most of the users are on that. But we also have a premium pack, and then we've got a bunch of different telco deals that we've got. So you can be on for example, in UAE, and you would get a 100 dirham data pack. You get Anghami free with it, stuff like that. So.
Thank you. The reason I was interested in that is because, and I don't want to give away my age by my example here, but in early days of digital, the concept of value was, and price per kind of content, almost music by the pound value, was a way that some of the early new experiences were created. Can I get 3 bonus tracks for the cost of 1 extra, right? There are premium Apple experiences that we're all part of. So I wanted all 3 of you in any order to weigh in on where does that value proposition play in the consumer's mindset when it comes to introducing new experiences? And is it still matters, or are these the early days such that if the experience is exceptional, the price of it is secondary to a consumer? Can you give some input on that? Maybe Sheryl, you want to start us on that?
Sure. I mean, from my perspective, the cost of, I do think value is important, but we've definitely gone in a direction in my mind where, essentially paying, sort of $12.99 a month for access to all of music in the world is quite a value, I would say. Right offhand. So I do think that where we're looking now is around differentiation in experience. I do think that's where consumers are looking now, because from a, music from a, I do think that music and podcasts have become in some ways a little too commoditized, and that we need to actually kind of move a little bit more into this direction of extending those new experiences. I also think that from an audio standpoint, that consumers are using audio in different ways. I know from my experiences that with my own family, that using smart speakers, for example, is it's not just used to sort of like play music or play the latest podcast, but it's also being used to sort of augment our conversation. And so when we're talking about what happened that day, being able to bring up sort of the latest news clip, or being able to talk a little bit more about sort of what was shared with you recently, and then kind of use your smart speaker as your own personal sort of bibliography, I think is just, for example, one of those ways in which sort of like your natural everyday life experiences start overlapping with what's accessible from a music standpoint. I'm sure there's thousands of examples, but I do think that that's what's being looked for.
I think, Mike, on the pricing front, I think, most of us who've worked at DSPs or worked closely with DSPs know how extremely tight the margins are at the current price point. So a lot of this innovation that we're talking about is difficult because it requires resources, it requires people and technologies to create these differentiated experiences. And when the margins are so tight, it's very difficult to do so. But, but what we've also seen is, with people more and more, moving to streaming services across the board, even, Netflix or meditation, with Headspace or Calm or 10% or whatever, people are getting to that point of like, well, wait a minute, I was trying to ditch my cable bill or whatever to be able to save some money and go over the top of these services. And now when I look at, what I'm paying across all these services, I'm actually paying more in some cases. So I think, it's going to be tough on the pricing front to try to find ways to increase prices, even when you're adding a lot more value and a lot more, experiences or a lot more, content, whether that's music or other types of programming. I think it's tough, but then it also depends, on the demographic, right? Because, we did loads of focus groups, I've done loads of focus groups, for the past 20 years in streaming. And, what you'll find is, there are certain, for example, the last panel I did, which was last year, so before the pandemic, and I'm sure the pandemic has impacted people's, propensity to pay or ability to pay, but college age, both female and male, were willing to pay oftentimes a premium. So, not just sticking to a kind of free service, they were willing to pay a premium, but they definitely had caps on what they were willing to pay. So they, if you talked about price increases, they're like, no, then I'll go free because, they have less ability to pay. So I think, it's tough to look at, pricing as across the board, but I do think that there is a potential to create more of these value add bundles and price them for different segments of the market. But there are definitely more and more people, especially right now, who are price conscious, but we have to recognize that if we can't raise the prices and the margins aren't changing anytime soon, then it's also going to be hard to continue to invest in these new differentiated services or innovation on the whole.
Great point. It's interesting how we're living. I'll go ahead, Arun. I didn't mean to step on what you're saying. Go ahead.
No, absolutely. I mean, I agree with Angel's point. I mean, but also, the fact that most like we would love to create more packages and more bundles and stuff. But also keeping in mind that we are actually kind of dictated by the major labels in terms of what we can do and we can't do. And there's a lot of, times where we're kind of stuck. We for example, in the Middle East, you would see a massive differentiation in terms of, what people can pay in UAE, for example, because the ARPUs are pretty much higher. It's a rich country. But you also have, on the other hand, Egypt, where your actual ARPU is $2 per month, which is nothing. So you can't expect the same benchmark to be applied in Egypt that you apply in UAE. And then we also have to deal with the labels dictating that you cannot price your product below a certain level. And then no matter how much innovation we want to bring in, we're always kind of sometimes stifled by the dictation of the labels. But that's the world we live in, so you got to live by it.
You had mentioned, Arun, earlier the live content that you've been involved with. This might sound surprising, and I'm not here to talk too much about MQA, but for the broader group, we're an audio technology company and act really as an ingredient technology inside of DSP platforms and content and copyright companies. But we launched our live technology in March of 2018, which now that seems like decades ago, right? I'm expecting that the live music business would see it as an opportunity to reach fans who couldn't get to venues. And at the time, of course, nobody was envisioning what we're all living through, but was just, hey, not every tour goes through every city. Not every tour starts in the same cities. Fans are not always aligned. How do we reach out to them? We didn't necessarily get the uptake at the time of the live promoters, but the OTT world picked up on it immediately because they saw it as an opportunity to immediately upgrade audio inside of video experiences. And the markets had been talking about 4, 8, all the K increments of video, and we hadn't told the story around audio for some time.
Right.
To think that necessity, I'll say, is what opened the mass market up to live entertainment and live music and live streaming gives us in some strange way another lever rather than just price to drive behavior change, which is how do you create that perception of need or make it so pursued or so cool or whatever it might be that people say, I have to be doing it. I think one of those examples is how consumers have become creators on many platforms that are becoming very important, right? That unlocks the traditional constraints that you're referring to, Arun, about licensing content from major companies, right?
No, we were actually thinking of launching the live anyways before the pandemic. And then the pandemic happened and we were like, artists want to do it now, users want it, and it's absolutely the best time. It was the right time for us to do it anyways. But before that, we were actually skeptical because we were like, how are you going to get the bigger artists? They're going to obviously, charge us the bomb and whatnot. But then eventually it all fell together, and unfortunately in a bad way. But but it did. And then
sometimes, Angel, back to your point about DSP startup collaboration. It's interesting because often the easiest artists to work with are not as well known. And so sometimes you might be showing off the experience before necessarily attracting a 2 or 3 million consumer fan base. Are there examples that you're looking at or thinking about in terms of experiences that would come from those types of collaborations?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so one of the big projects that we were working on as a venture studio with a major spirits brand was specifically looking at how do you, first of all, create greater transparency around venues who are already playing music, whether that's a bar or a restaurant or whatever, to be able to kind of broadcast out what the vibe is of any particular venue at any particular moment, right? And so, and there are lots of different aspects to that too. There are companies like Soundtrack Your Brand and things like that where, where you have these in-venue streaming services, but they're still not tied into point of sale, for example. So you don't really know, are you, you're making guesses around, is there any relationship between the music that you're playing and your alcohol sales? Like, there are lots of interesting areas that, that I've been focused on and lots of opportunities for new services. And I think, in those, for those, one of the things that, that I think is kind of, disappointing, kind of going to Arun's point and also to your question, Mike, is that, the labels have these embryonic digital innovation licenses, and they call them different things at the different labels, but they haven't really gone anywhere, and they're complicated because then you also have to, get the publishers on board and et cetera. But I think that there is a room for a SoundCloud or even a BBC or some new startups to say, hey, we're going to start, from scratch. And these are the licensing terms, up until an app gets a certain amount of consumption, right? So for example, any artist can come on board, but it's going to be basically free until we hit a certain number of streams. Then once we hit a certain number of streams, then it's going to trigger a whole new, commercial model where people have to, pay for access, whether that's transactional, through virtual items, through subscription. I think we need to create more of a sandbox, if you will, for both the creators, whether that's, musicians or other creators, users who want to create new mixes. And we have to make it easier for them to be able to, at least get up to a stage to see whether or not there's any demand for these things, right? So it's, it might be more DIY artists, it might be more unsigned artists who are more willing to do this because they want greater exposure, but I would love to see, some of the bigger artists just saying like, hey, I personally want to be part of creating new music experiences. So I'm willing, whether it's the label, the artist, the publisher, everyone who needs to come together on these things, I'm willing to kind of put my music out there. But as soon as we start seeing that there's some, some good, streaming consumption going on, then that triggers, you know, all the normal licensing, you know, et cetera. So I think a lot of the kind of digital innovation licenses haven't really been a big priority because obviously they're not huge income generators. But I think, you know, we could go the other way and work with DIY artists on these new licensing mechanisms that create these new experiences that we're talking about. So we have to find ways to allow people to invest in innovation to create, you know, new products, new experiences, you know, new ways to create commercial businesses that benefits everybody.
Sheryl, I know, and I don't mean to imply it's an easy business because you don't deal typically in the same streaming licensing environment that we're talking about with Arun and Angel, but can you talk a little bit about content availability and content creation? I know that's both personally in your scope of responsibilities, but how when your company wants to try a new idea or test out a consumer's reaction, maybe even to a new value proposition, how do you go about determining the content that will go into that innovation or that first time experience? Is it known that there are the easier folks to speak to that are already on the platform versus the ones that might be more challenging? Or is it less black and white than what I'm suggesting?
I think I'm not sure if I'm totally following your question. I think it's, you know, we essentially do try to provide ways to test out new content on the platform. But, you know, is your question around, can you just tell me a little bit more about what you're—
Sure. I think one of the elements that Angel was picking up on is sometimes it's hard for small companies to innovate on top of music because there's a lot of traditional infrastructure and cost and administration that you have to go through just to try an idea or an experience out. And so this idea of lining up verticals without necessarily needing the world's content to start to do things is one aspect, not the only thing she was saying, but one aspect of it. And I wondered how that plays out in your world where both ad-based, but in many cases maybe DMCA compliant based experiences, how do you get the consumer's attention to a new type of experience? And where do you get the content from for that? Is it already baked into the rights that you're securing for today's business, or do you have to go back out and reopen those conversations?
Well, in some cases, we have to go back out and reopen the conversations for sure. It's sort of, you know, it's a little bit of a case-by-case basis, but we have been trying out some you know, new innovations where we're trying to sort of put out sort of new bundles of content. I think as Angel was indicating before earlier, it's sort of these vertical bundles of content that will include both DMCA radio play, but also trying to overlay a certain level of sort of customized experiences or ability for artists to include sort of voice tracks, for example. So I think there's so we're kind of constantly doing testing to try to figure out sort of how to surface the right content to the right listeners. But you know, but as far as like whether it requires additional rights conversations, it's really on a case-by-case basis.
Got it. Okay. I am being given the wave at us for time. So I'm going to ask each of you to weigh in on the same topic. And it's one that you can take in any direction that you want. Are you looking at even non-entertainment categories that are going to be disrupted or are ripe for disruption that you think music and streaming could play a role? You know, a former example of this might have been in the pre-ride sharing days. You know, who would have said we're going to put together your personal account, attach it to your Uber account so that your music travels with you when you jump into an Uber, right? There's an example of that. Are there things to come to mind that you're watching that are categories ripe for disruption? And should we be, and how should we be thinking about making sure that music consumption is central to that behavior down the road? Maybe Arun, start with you on that one.
Yeah, the way I see it, and I've got a 7-year-old, and the attention span of the 7 years to even like 20-year-olds now is not beyond 5 seconds, right? So it's really hard for me to get her to sit down and watch a 2-hour Disney movie. So the way I see it, obviously, to bring up the stickiness, we will have to somehow look at a way that how we can actually integrate with these short form video platforms, or video is going to be key for us. We're still looking at how whether it's going to be a long form video content or short form, but I do see that there is definitely going to be some kind of an amalgamation there.
Thank you. Angel, what are your thoughts?
I think all of the streaming services, regardless of the nature of the content, whether it's video, long form, short form, meditation, you name it, I think they're all challenged with this question of differentiation. So I think that there could be lots of opportunity to create more personalization, and not just commercial bundles, but bundling of different types of content. So I think it'll be interesting to see how we can look at the consumer, not just from our own kind of specific lens, but their total, streaming consumption, and ways that we can personalize those experiences around what they want. And we have to anticipate those wants and desires as well, because a lot of people don't tell you exactly what they want. So you have to experiment. So I hope that we get to a stage where we're experimenting more.
Right on. Sheryl?
So I completely agree with Angel. I think in terms of those those bundles are really going to be key, and essentially like ensuring a sort of seamless transition from sort of listening in one place to listening to the next, to listening into the next, and being able to sort of personalize that audio content and those bundles with whether someone wants to listen to news in the car and then walk in the door and listen to music, and then sort of wake up in the morning and start hearing the latest sort of sports. I think it's sort of like tailoring those personalized bundles and also tailoring them to the space the listener is in at the moment is really what we need to start focusing on.
Well, there's nothing like listening to people who have really done it. So I just want to express my thanks to each of you for joining in the conversation and sharing your thoughts on this.